Morning. It's good to see all of you here this morning, and we encourage all of you listening, to be sure and come out and join your meet with your local Church of Christ. That's the only place that we can encourage one another and build one another up. And we encourage you to come out and be with us. Certainly glad to have all of you here today. I'm subbing for Reed, and one of the things that Reed does all the time is whatever color Kathy puts on, he puts on too. They color coordinate all the time, if you didn't know that, but they do. And this morning we're driving over here, and Peg says, "Oh, we got the same colors. The only difference being that I have blue pants and she has gray pants." So I guess we are following in his footsteps. If you didn't pick up a bulletin, you should pick up a bulletin and read the article in it. It's one of those strange things that happens. The article is about life or death, a choice. My lesson is a lot about choosing life or death and what happens. So be sure and pick that up and read that. I'm going to talk about I think this must be on Egyptian bondage. We know the story, a lot of story, but we're going to recap it real quick. A lot of that. So the Exodus frames a picture of how God wants to work within our lives to set us free. Us, looking at us and to set us free. In walking with the Israelites, as they witness the miracles that bring them to freedom, we find fresh evidence of the way that God moves today to free us from things that enslave us. We are enslaved to things. And it keeps us from enjoying an intimate relationship with God. That's what it does, what these things of the world do to us to keep us from enjoying God. Their story that we read in the first part of the Bible is our story. The places may be different, but their hearts are remarkably similar. The chains that bind their hearts to Egypt may have different names, but the power God is willing to wield to set us free is the same as he did to set them free. The story of the Exodus actually begins in the last chapters of Genesis, chapters 41 through 50. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, has 12 sons. In a bitter scene of sibling rivalry, the older brothers sell Joseph into bondage. He goes down to Egypt in a Midianite caravan, becoming the slave of an Egyptian official named Potiphar. Through a series of events that he comes to understand were orchestrated by God, Joseph is raised up to the second most important position in the land, lower only than Pharaoh himself. And if you think about that, that in itself is really odd, to have a foreigner as your second in command in your country. It would be, I would think, something like if our president was more of like a king, and he brought in somebody like from India that has a totally different culture and everything from us, and made them vice president. That would be a big kind of difference of what it would be, how big this was. So it's difficult to understand the power that Joseph holds in Egypt. His word is law. He has the ear of Pharaoh. He travels throughout the land, organizing the people so that they will survive the famine God has told him is coming. And using the wisdom given to him by the Lord, Joseph touches every part of Egyptian life. Eventually, Joseph is reunited with his family, arriving from Canaan in search of food. Remember, they all come up there looking for food. There's this big famine going on all over the world, and they need food. and Egypt has food. People know they have food. So Joseph meets his brothers, and in the end reveals his identity to them. He makes arrangements for his elderly father to be brought to Egypt and then settle in the land of Goshen. As Jacob leaves Canaan, he seeks the blessing of the Lord. Now, this is the father of Joseph, seeks the blessing of the Lord. And God makes some promises to Jacob as he prepares to go to Egypt. In Genesis 46 and verses 1 through 6 and 26 and 27, he says, "So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Then God spoke to Israel is Jacob, in the visions of the night and said, 'Jacob, Jacob.' And he said, 'Here I am.' So he said, 'I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes.'" And then, then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones and their wives in the carts, with which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. So they took their livestock and their goods, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with them. And then, 26 to 27, all the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2 persons. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were 70. So 70 people basically are there in Egypt. In that promise, God says 3 things. I will make you a great nation in Egypt. I will go with you, and I will bring you up out of Egypt. And as the story progresses, you'll find that the children of Israel, I guess you say, bring up the coffin of Jacob. They bring it back. That's one of the things they do, is they carry it out of Egypt back to the land, promised land. For 40 years, they carry that coffin around with them, too. So now, fast forwarding more than 300 years brings us to the account of the Exodus. Exodus 1 serves as a bridge between the end of Genesis and the time in which we join Israel before they leave Egypt. Written by Moses, Exodus gives us a front row seat for the amazing process of redemption God plans to work on behalf of his people. Exodus 1, 6, and 7 says, "And Joseph died, all his brothers and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." And then 12:37 says, "Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children." So they had grown to like 600,000 men. And these were, I can't remember the exact ages, but like from 20 to 50 or something like that. And that's 600,000 fighters, people that would fight in the army, for them in the army. From a company of 70, Jacob's family has grown into a nation numbering 600,000 men while living in the fertile Nile Delta region of Goshen. Adding in women and children, estimates place the number of Israelites at around 2 to 3 million, something like that, at the time of this Exodus. Exodus 1, 8 through 14 tells us that as the decades accumulate into centuries, the memory of Joseph's wisdom and power fades. A new king rises in the Egyptian throne, leaving history in the past. The new Pharaoh evaluates the strength and vulnerabilities of his new kingdom. He's looking to see how strong the Egyptians are and how strong the Israelites are. Once a small family, the Israelites now cover the land of Goshen. The new kings see in their numbers a great threat to the stability in his new kingdom. He orders chains of captivity to be wrapped around the necks of the Israelites. Look at the life the Israelites now have under their Egyptian masters. In Exodus 1:11 through 14, it says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." The embittered life the Israelites now have under the Egyptians unveils sorrow and wretchedness, the sorrow and wretchedness of slavery. Their slavery is a picture of the captivity of our hearts today. Oppression speaks to the pressure put on us by the evil that surrounds us. And there's we talk a lot about what do you want? Anything what they are. Teenagers, the pressure teenagers have in school and their lives. But we all face these types of pressures in us. And it presses in on our hearts. It's just tough to overcome. Oppression speaks to the pressure put on us by the evil that surrounds us. It presses us in on our hearts, pushes us to conform to its desires. That's what it does, pushes us to conform to its desires. Forced labor defines a life where our choices are limited by greed. We give our lives to activities that build kingdoms and treasure cities, but don't meet the deepest needs of our hearts. Ruthlessness describes an existence devoid of compassion, joy, or kindness. Within the reality of captivity, there is only room for self-interest, fear, cruelty, and pride become the basis masters of our souls. Those things become the things that rule us. Bitterness is the final ingredient in slavery's recipe. It creeps into our hearts, robbing us of dignity and hope. All of us struggle with slave masters, with one of these things as our slave masters. There are pieces of every heart that are held captive by fear, selfishness, bitterness, or the pressure of the world. Our journey with Jesus is the journey to being set free from the slave masters which entangle and ensnare us. Israel's people live in Egypt, enslaved by the people among whom they once sought safety. Egypt is a mighty nation and the dominant political power throughout the early history of the Bible. Its great wealth and influence grow from its position along the Mediterranean Sea and the stable crop productions it enjoys from the ever-flowing waters of the Nile River. Its economic strength and military might make it a nation that influences God's people for centuries. And if you look at history, you see this. This Exodus took place, I don't know if I'll get this right, but roughly 1,200 years before Christ. It was that long of a period. And what was in power, and throughout all that time, Egypt was a power. Then the Romans come and take over there. But we all know the story of, what's his name? Cleopatra, anyway, and her. And that's happening at this time of around Christ. And how out of power Egypt still is even though the Romans do not conquer Egypt. So you can see that Egyptian power was a long time throughout history. And so from a company here of 70 people, Jacob's family has grown into an... I didn't change pages. So the religion of Egypt is complex. It's a nation of many gods. There are so many different deities worshipped by the Egyptians, it's hard to count them all. The estimates place the number of Egyptian gods between 80 and 125, with many more unaccounted local gods. Local places had their own gods. The gods of Egypt are closely associated with nature. Remember the Ten Commandments, what they were. You have water, starting the order. Water was turned to blood, and then they had frogs. Now, those two, Pharaoh's magicians, along with their staffs being eaten by Moses' staff, they could kind of duplicate what Moses has done here, these first two miracles, but they cannot duplicate any of the next 8 that happen. So the next ones are lice, and we're talking about them being associated with nature. You have lice, flies, the livestock get a disease and die. They have boils, they have hail, they have locusts, darkness, and then of course the 10th one being death of the firstborn. So those are the 10 plagues and how they are associated with nature. Many of the gods are portrayed as having animal or insect characteristics. These gods are interwoven in a tangled line of mythology that stretches back through the centuries. As different leaders rise to prominence, they bring different gods to the forefront of Egyptian society. And those that the previous one had are still there. Temples and places of worship are found throughout the land and throughout Egyptian society. And Egyptian culture, they're there. Boast very large priestly castes. They have these priestly castes that are part of their culture. The lives of the people in Egypt are saturated with the presence and attempts to please the multiple gods that surround them, trying to please these gods. And we're finding that same thing going on in our New Testament studies of these books, like Colossians and what we just had in class this morning, we're talking about in Timothy, Titus. Yeah, I can't remember what we're in, but in the book of Titus, the same thing. It's happening throughout these New Testament books too. And it's not unlike what Paul encounters in Athens. In chapter 17 of Acts, verse 16 and 22 through 23 says, "Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship,'" they had all these different idols and worship, says, "I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.'" Then he goes on to say, "I'm going to reveal the unknown God to you." So they had, just like in the New Testament, is just like that in the time of Moses. At the head of the Egyptian culture is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a title for the ruler of the land of Egypt. There is much discussion among scholars about the exact identity of this Pharaoh, and there are dozens of different theories by experts in Egyptology, each seeking to identify who the man was, which Pharaoh it was. But that isn't the most important point of this part of this lesson. Instead, we will focus on identifying what Pharaoh represents in the story of redemption what he represents. Egypt in general and Pharaoh in particular give us insight into the perspective of the world. Pharaoh teaches us how the ungodly mind sees and reacts to movements, commands, and love of God. He identifies for us a particular world view. I missed that. I want to back up just a little bit. It says, like ancient cultures of Egypt and Athens, we live in a society that celebrates spirituality. Religious thought is all around us, and a multiplicity of beliefs is extended to the highest of God. Colossians was that way. What I talked about, all these books in different places talk about this. We are encouraged to explore different avenues of spirituality, and each path is promoted as one more way to reach the divine. I think that was one of Alex's statements this morning, that they're brought in to our cult, to our services. This is a way of getting more spiritual. This is in contrast to what Jesus says in John 14:6, where he says, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's the only way to get to God or to Jesus, through him, as opposed to going through these other gods and things. So now we're back to the worldview. Worldview is a philosophical term that means how one sees the world, how we see the world. Everybody has a worldview. Everyone has a particular set of glasses through which they look at the world and make decisions about what is happening around them. We use the term to describe someone who chooses to see everything in a positive light. Wearing rose-colored glasses refers to a type of perspective or worldview. Our chosen perspective allows us to process information and make our next move, and make our next decision. There are three primary questions that are answered by whatever worldview you choose. Now, this is kind of the difference in programs, I think, that each one of those three was supposed to come in separate. So anyway, first one is, what is my purpose? Philosophers have been wrestling with the meaning of life since the beginning of time. Pharaoh will show us a worldview which says that pleasure, satisfying self, and looking out for one's self-interest is the purpose of life. Does that sound familiar to our Reed's Sunday morning lessons that he's been talking about? He speaks not only of ancient Egypt, but for our culture as well. A God view reminds us that our deepest purpose lies in reflecting the glory of the Lord. Remember what Reed has ended every lesson with on Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes 12:13, where he says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is a man's all. That's all what we should be. So, next question, where is my place in this world? Pharaoh sits on a throne. It is more than a physical throne. It is a throne which announces to the world that he is the center of the universe. He wants everyone to know that the world revolves around him. A perspective defined by Christ leads us to a place by the Father's side. Our identity is rooted in our relationship with him, rather than the claim we can stake in the world. Then the third question was, who has the power to control my life? Pharaoh sees himself as a man of power. He believes he has the power to control his destiny, determine the course of his nation, and the people under his rule, and the right to stand or bow as he chooses. And you look at our world and things going on, it seems like that's the way it's going, too. That people trying to rule our lives, show who has the power. And then fundamentally to a God view is the understanding that Jesus is Lord. He not only has the right, but also the power to direct our lives and change our hearts. He can do this. Look at 1 Corinthians 1:18 through 31. It says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God. It pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign, and Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, it's a stumbling block, and to the Greeks, foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised God has chosen. And the things which are not to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. But of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. That as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. One example of that foolishness, what he brings as foolishness, goes on right now today, where we preach baptism is important to salvation. This is just one thing. The world is saying baptism isn't necessary. And because it's foolish, they think of it as being foolish, that baptism is foolish to your salvation. So Jesus spent much of his time on earth pulling people's eyes from the world view to a God view. He turned the worldly perspective on its head and encouraged people to look at their lives through the eyes of God. Give some examples. Matthew 16:25 says, "For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." The worldview is, put everything into gaining riches for this life he will lose his soul. The God view is, whoever gives up things of this world for Jesus will save his soul. Another one, there, Matthew 18:1-4 says, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him on his midst of them, and said, "Surely I say to you, unless you are converted and become like a little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." The worldview is become the most powerful you can. You can become the most powerful, whatever it happens to be. That's the worldview. The God view is humble yourself and become as a child. Then another one is Matthew 19:16, where he says, "Now behold, one came and said to him, 'Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?'" The worldview is money will get you to heaven. The God view is With God, all things are possible. And then Matthew 20:26, another one. Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. The worldview, become the boss. Get your power, become the boss. The God view is, become a servant, serve others. So Jesus can set, look at this thing. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Then you have the crossing, that's Egypt on the left, you have the crossing the chains, and he broke their chains, their bondage there, and they entered Sinai. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, out of that land of slavery, into the land of being free. So Jesus consistently challenged us to see beyond the physical and discover the rich wonders of the spiritual world. Life is bigger than we can touch through our senses. Our hearts were made to embrace the infinite possibilities of walking by faith with God. A worldview tells us that clinging to life, grabbing it with both hands, putting ourselves first, and measuring life by our own strength is the only way to live. Jesus helps us to see that only when we die to self, take the place of a servant, become like a child, and put our lives in God's hands, can we truly live. This, in a nutshell, is a conflict that lies at the heart of learning to be free indeed. We are held captive by the worldviews that permeate our society. The thinking, motives, desires, and focus of the world wound tightly through our hearts, impacting the way we see and respond to the movements of God. Being set free involves allowing God to cut away the world views that hold our hearts captive and opening our eyes to a God view. 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18 says, Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Well, we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Do you want to live? To live, you need to live a life that Christ, and serving of Christ, being a servant. And if you have any needs, you've been baptized, but you feel that you need help and strength from the rest of us, we encourage you to come. Or if you have not taken on Christ in baptism and started your Christian walk and wish to live for Christ, we ask that you come as we